The following two videos are still my favorite presentations from Bernardo Kastrup. In the first, he refutes materialism, and in the second, he defends metaphysical idealism, the notion that all of reality is basically consciousness. These two very robust presentations answer most initial questions that come up for people on this topic, so I do urge you to start here. But then in the original 2020 course, we followed on with 2 weeks of open Q&A and discussion, which led to some of the most profound and personal conversations that I've ever been privileged to witness. And these were so successful that we've continued to do this twice a year, meet with Bernardo for 4 or 5 weeks, ask questions, get into discussions, and also include guests such as Michael Levin, Federico Fagin, Christopher Wallace, Rupert Spira, and coming up in November 2024, the celebrated neuroscientist Christoph Koch. So if you enjoy these discussions and you want to join us, discuss these with Bernardo Kastrup and quite an amazing community of meditators, mystics, philosophers, scientists, and simply ordinary people who are very curious about reality, you can find us in the links below or at adventuresinawareness.com. You can also hugely support this channel by hitting like, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts, questions, and reflections in the comments section below.
I'm ready to go.
Yes.
All right. So last week we basically talked about materialism or mainstream metaphysical physicalism, same thing. Why it is a relatively weak metaphysical proposition. It has many holes and perhaps one or two unsurmountable problems, and yet it's the mainstream metaphysical narrative of our culture. So now that we are done undermining that, now we have to come up with an alternative. It's not enough to shoot somebody else's case. Your story is more legitimate if you can offer another one, a better case, and that's the point for today. The 2 sessions that will come after today, next week, and the week after that will basically be extended Q&As, so more free format. We can talk about anything you like. Today it's still a little bit structured. I have a couple of slides to go through. You can ask questions. I'll take questions at the end of each slide, so you don't have to write it down and hold on to it until the end. All right, so the case for idealism with a focus on empirical evidence, because that seems to be the strongest point according to our cultural values. These days, you gotta have empirical evidence, and guess what? There's plenty of empirical evidence for ideas. Just know that reality is essentially and fundamentally mental. It's not your mind alone, it's not in mind alone, it's just in mind and ontological ground as a tendency to think that the world out there is outside consciousness. Not only outside our consciousness, but outside consciousness in general. It's a very strong intuition in our culture, a superficial one, but a very strong one nonetheless. So where does it come from? There are 3 reasons why we tend to think that, and these are the reasons that motivate materialism to begin with. Reason number 1, we know that our conscious inner life, our experiences, correlate with brain function. I mean, we can be sophisticated about it and say that, you know, neuroscience has found tight, beautiful correlations between certain patterns of brain activity and the reported experience of the subjects. So if you're having pain, certain areas of the brain light up. If you're falling in love or you're afraid, other areas of the brain light up in specific ways. There is even what they call now brain image extraction. I'm not going to go into details of that today. We can extensively cover that next time around, but in a nutshell is by reading the patterns of our brain activity, neuroscientists can even infer what we are thinking of or what we are visualizing or what experience we are having. So this is the sophisticated part. But there is a very non-sophisticated and a more obvious way to argue for these correlates. I mean, if you drink alcohol, you're putting a substance inside your body, and that alters your inner experience. If you're in a fight and you get punched in your head, you may be knocked down. That will influence your physical experience, your inner experience. A physical event influences your inner conscious experience. So there are obvious and undeniable correlations between brain function and conscious inner life, which leads us to think that the world out there is not only outside our consciousness, it's outside consciousness in general, because it's physical and it impacts our own consciousness. Another reason is we all seem to share the same world. We describe the world we live in consistent, mutually consistent ways. So it seems that our consciousness inhabits a world that is beyond my consciousness, your consciousness, anybody's consciousness. And then we make the mistake and we say it's outside consciousness in general. No, it's just outside our consciousness. But nonetheless, this is a motivation to think this way. And we also can't change the world by merely wishing it to be different, because otherwise the world would be different already. I would have wished it to be very different from what it is now. Somehow our mental wishes, our felt desires, our felt fears, they don't seem to have an impact in the world out there in a direct way, which also leads us superficially to think, hey, that means that the world out there is not mental, because if it were mental, I would be able to influence it just like I influence my imagination. I can sit and choose what I'm going to imagine in my own head, but I can't sit and choose what the world is going to be like. Well, that also is based on an obvious misunderstanding. We can't choose and control our dreams when we are asleep, unless we are lucid dreaming, which is rare. We can't choose and control our neuroses. Somebody who has a psychosis, like schizophrenia, cannot choose and control their hallucinations. As a matter of fact, we can't even choose and control our thoughts. Your next thought doesn't come from choice. More often than not, it doesn't come from choice. It just pops in your head. We even can't choose our feelings. We just react to something and we feel the way we feel, and that's about it. So it's a fable that everything that resides in mind can be controlled by a direct act of volition. It's a fable. We know of things that are purely mental, like schizophrenic hallucinations, dreams and nightmares, which are not acquiescent to our volition anyway, and they are still fully mental. So the same might apply to our shared world. It may be mental, although it's not acquiescent to our volition. But anyway, these are the three reasons we tend to think that the world is outside consciousness as such, not only mine or yours, but consciousness as such. The way to overcome this, which is essentially a prejudice, the way to overcome this prejudice is to start from where physicist Andrei Linde hinted a few years ago. Andrei Linde is famous for the idea of cosmic inflation, which is perhaps the leading cosmogenesis theory in the world today, the leading theory about what happened in the universe at its earliest stages of evolution. He said, and maybe I'll even read it together with you, let us remember that our knowledge of the world begins not with matter, but with perceptions. That's all we have. The world presents itself to us as perception. Matter is a story, and he explains that. He says, I know for sure that my pain and experience exists. My green exists, my green as experienced. That my sweet exists, sweet as an experienced flavor. Everything else is a theory, he says. Later, we find out that our perceptions obey some laws, which can be most conveniently formulated if we assume that there is some underlying reality beyond our perceptions, some shared reality. This model of a material world, so the assumption here is of matter, that matter underlies our perceptions. This model of a material world obeying laws of physics is so successful that soon we forget about our starting point and say that matter is the only reality. He continues on 2 statements after this. He says, and it may be wrong, this idea about matter being the only reality may be completely wrong. So he's clearly bringing us back to the starting point and revealing where we make unexamined assumptions. Matter is an explanatory model. It's a convenient assumption, convenient for the formulation of physical theory. But that things happen as though they were material doesn't mean that they are material in the way that matter is defined. That is, something that is exhaustively described quantitatively and not qualitatively. So let's stick to this. Let's heed Andre Linde's advice, and let's continue on with our story. Instead of starting from this unexamined assumption that Linde has just revealed to us and brought our attention to, let's start instead from incontrovertible observations, not explanatory models, not convenient assumptions for the formulation of physical theory, not explanations, but observations, what is right in front of us and cannot be denied. First one is, we know there is experience. That's the starting point of it all. We experience things, and from there we start making theories, but it starts from experience. So there is experience. It's the one given fact of nature, the one given of nature, so to say, the one undeniable thing. And we can immediately conclude from that, because it is a direct implication, that there is an experiencer, because experience only exists for an experiencer, for that which experiences. So there is a subject, there is an experiencer, at least one. Maybe there are more, but there's certainly at least one, and that one is you, as far as you are concerned. Now, whatever else it may be, brain function is a perceptual experience. We talk about brain function because a neuroscientist experiences the output of a scanner, of a brain scanner, because a neurosurgeon experiences the workings of your brain during surgery. So brain activity or brain function, insofar as it can be known, is itself an experience. The experience of the brain surgeon, the experience of the neuroscientist. You experience it from within, they from without, but it is still an experience. It's their observation, their conscious observation of what we call brain function. Another incontrovertible observation, but this one here has a little concession, a linguistic concession. We know that the brain is made of matter. Now, by saying this, I'm not granting the definition of matter of mainstream materialism. I am not granting here that matter is something exhaustively definable in terms of quantities. I'm not saying that it's all that exists. Whatever it is, there is this thing we've come to call matter. I'm not passing judgment on it. Whatever it is, there is this thing we all understand to be called matter. So the brain is made of that. Whatever matter is, the brain is made of matter, right? I'm just using a common word. I'm using matter here not as a philosophical definition, but as a common colloquial word. From that colloquial perspective, it is undeniable that the brain is a material object. All right, so let's keep these 3 incontrovertible observations in mind. What's the simplest way to interpret them? The most parsimonious, the least inflationary, the one that demands the least number of assumptions or postulates and so on. Well, let's start with the first. There is experience, and therefore there is an experiencer. Now, the easiest, simplest, most parsimonious way to interpret this is to say that experiences are excitations of the experiencer, in the same way that ripples in water are excitations of water, or that a dance, a choreography is an excitation of the dancer. There is nothing to the dance but to the dancer in movement. There is only the dancer. There is nothing to ripples but water in movement. There is only water. In exactly the same way, there is nothing to experience but the experiencer in movement, undergoing excitation. Why is this parsimonious? because it avoids a fundamental distinction between experience and experiencer. If you would postulate a fundamental distinction between the two, it would already by definition be less parsimonious. Moreover, it would create a whole host of problems, which is how does experience and experiencer interact with one another? Because clearly they are correlated. If they are different, how are they then interacting with one another? You avoid all this and you stick to the most parsimonious, the simplest interpretation. If you just say that experiencers are the experiencer under excitation, in movement, in vibration, whatever metaphor you prefer to use.
Could we just get a reminder of the definition of parsimonious?
Yeah. Parsimonious, yeah, in colloquial language, is the simplest. The explanation that requires the least assumptions, the least postulates. Last week I talked about if you would wake up in the morning and see some footprints in your backyard, and there would be two explanations. One of them would be you're postulating that a would-be burglar tried to break into your house and left some footprints in your backyard. And the other one would be aliens landing on a spaceship on your neighbor's house, stealing your neighbor's shoes, jumping the fence and walking around in your backyard. Well, that requires many more postulates. It requires that there be aliens. It requires that aliens can travel to the Earth. It requires that a spaceship needs to land. It requires that it would have landed on your neighbor's yard. It requires aliens that felt like stealing shoes. And then it requires aliens that felt like jumping the fence and going for a stroll in your backyard, and then going back, putting your neighbor's shoes back, boarding their ship and going away. Many, many, many more postulates. So the burglar explanation is more parsimonious. In the same sense, to say that the experience is but an excitation of the experiencer is the most parsimonious. It doesn't require aliens and spaceships and all that. Now, obviously, there are two experiential perspectives that are correlated. One is the extrinsic, which I have been referring to as brain function. A neuroscientist, just a second, I see that there are things happening on the chat window and not in the Q&A, so I was missing whatever was happening in the chat window.
That's okay, that's just us trying to get some definitions down in there.
Oh, okay, okay.
Chat, yeah.
So brain function as measured or observed by a neurosurgeon or a neuroscientist is definitely an experience of the neurosurgeon, an experience of the neuroscientist. That would be the extrinsic view of your inner life as the subject, as the person inside the brain scanner or the person undergoing neurosurgery. Now, from your perspective, the experiences that present themselves to the neuroscientist and the neurosurgeon as brain function, from your perspective, you have a direct first-person view of those experiences. Let me give concrete examples. Suppose you're participating in a study and you're invited to lie under a brain scanner, a functional brain scanner, and you're asked to imagine a scary situation. This happens, by the way, I'm not making it up. This stuff happens. So you imagine a scary situation where you're lying in the brain scanner. So you have a self-induced but direct experience of fear. You feel fear. Sometimes the neuroscientists, they help you induce that by showing you scary pictures. So you feel fear. The fear you feel is the intrinsic perspective of that experience, the experience of fear. The intrinsic view is the direct experience of fear. But the neuroscientist is looking at the monitor of the brain scanner, and he's seeing some patterns of brain activity. That's an experience of the neuroscientist. That experience is the extrinsic perspective of your fear. The fear you feel directly is the intrinsic view. The patterns of brain activity on the scanner that are experienced by the neuroscientists are the extrinsic appearance of your fear. So your fear presents itself to you as directly felt fear, intrinsic, but it presents itself to the outside world, to the neuroscientist, to the neurosurgeon as patterns of brain activity. Both are fear, but fear regarded from different perspectives. The first person perspective of you, and the second or third person perspective of the neuroscientist, the neurosurgeon, and so on. So it is all experience, but experience does have different perspectives, at least two, an intrinsic and an extrinsic, and I think only two. Third, what we call brain function, I already hinted at that, is nothing but the extrinsic appearance of your conscious inner life. Your brain function is how your conscious inner life presents itself to observation from a different perspective, not your first person perspective. Even if you are the one looking at the monitor of the brain scanner while you're lying in the brain scanner, it will be you having both experiences, but it will still be two experiences. You will be regarding your own fear through two different perspectives, an intrinsic one, the felt fear, and an extrinsic one, the perceptual experience of patterns of brain activity on a display. So there are almost always two perspectives to experience. These are the simplest ways of interpreting those undeniable observations. Remember, we are not starting from theory, we are starting from what is given, and we are trying to interpret what is given in the simplest, most parsimonious way possible. I see there is a question. Should I read it, Amir? Because today I put the Q&A visible.
It's up to you. If you prefer to read it, that's great. If you want me to read, whatever you prefer.
I'll read it. It's a question from Noor. So in this case, the experience is consciousness. In other words, consciousness is acting through me or appearing through me. Is that correct? Therefore, we have the same distinct ontological origin. Otherwise, how could we interact? I don't recall exactly at what moment you wrote this, Noor, so you may be referring to something I said a couple of minutes ago. Experience is, for me, what we call experience is a particular excitation of consciousness. That's why experiences have different qualities. Fear is qualitatively different from happiness, which is qualitatively different from tasting strawberries, which is qualitatively different from having a bellyache, which is qualitatively different from being depressed. These are all experiences. The experiential aspect is what unites them, is what makes them all the same. They are all felt experiences. But they are qualitatively different. And the way to make sense of that is to say that each experience, each particular quality corresponds to a particular pattern of excitation of consciousness. So experience and consciousness, experience is consciousness in this exact same way that a ripple is water, or that a dancer is the dancer, because there is nothing to the dance but the dancer in movement, because there is nothing to a ripple but water in movement. In the same way, there's nothing to experience but consciousness in movement. So experience implies or entails consciousness, because it is an excitation of consciousness. It's a movement or a vibration of consciousness. But consciousness is the ground. You cannot say that, yeah, you could even say that consciousness is experience, so long as you assume that consciousness is never at rest, that it's always moving, that there is a primary tone, a drone, as they call it in musical theory, that hum that underlies every other note. If you think that it is impossible for consciousness to not be excited in one way or another, then consciousness is experience too. However, if you think that consciousness, theoretically, I know it's practically not possible, but if consciousness, whatever it is, theoretically at least, and in principle, can come to a complete and absolute rest, then there would be consciousness without experience. In the same way that the surface of a lake in absolute rest is water, but is not ripples. In the same way that the dancer can exist without the dance, if the dancer is at rest and not moving, not dancing. This is a difficult subject. We can explore this more in one of the next 2 sessions, which are more freewheeling. But I'll leave you with that. I'm not sure this really captures your question, but it's the nearest thing I came up with. And then Frank, I hope I'm not missing any questions because they are rolling up. Frank asks, does my intrinsic experience pass through the extrinsic to another consciousness to then be reformed into a different intrinsic experience of the other? Absolutely. When the neuroscientist is looking at the display of a brain scanner, his perceptual experience from his perspective is intrinsic. He's seeing the display is his inner life. But this intrinsic experience of his corresponds or correlates with an intrinsic experience of yours, you being the subject lying inside the brain scanner. So ultimately, there are only intrinsic views. Every experience is always intrinsic. There is nothing but intrinsic experiences. I talk about extrinsic just as a way to highlight the fact that sometimes an intrinsic experience of subject A is directly and intimately correlated with an intrinsic experience of subject B. And then we can say that from the point of view of A, the intrinsic experiences of subject B present themselves as brain activity, or as the body of a person in distress, gesticulating and screaming, or the tears of someone crying. These are all ways in which we sort of convey information about our own inner life to another one. And at that moment, that information becomes the inner life of the other person. The idea of an extrinsic experience serves only the purpose to associate two correlated intrinsic experiences. And it's valid to use this term, extrinsic, because you see, from my perspective, my intrinsic experiences present themselves to you as something extrinsic to me. So even the word extrinsic has a ground on the subject itself, in this case, me. I understand that if you really dig deep into this, it can appear to become fuzzy and confusing. I assure you it's not. And not using this concept of extrinsic appearance is counterproductive. It leads to a lot more difficulty in trying to explain what I'm trying to explain now. It's much more direct for people to grok what I'm putting across if I use this concept of an extrinsic experience. And there is room for it. You just have to interpret it carefully. And you went far enough to see where the weakness was, and your question is a good one. Tom Klim. Does information play a role in the dance of the dancer or the movement of the ripple in the water? I think information is a description. We are able to capture or describe the richness of experience through the concept of information. I don't think information exists in and of itself. It does not exist without that which it describes, namely experience, in the same way that there is no dance without, well, that I'm overusing this metaphor. Let me think of another metaphor. If we want to quantify how rich an experience is, how many different possible states it can manifest, then we talk about there being more information. And things that have little information have little richness of experience, of corresponding experience, less different states, a lesser amount of different states they can assume. For instance, my home thermostat, well, not anymore, but in the old days, my home thermostat would have only 2 states. It's either on and the boiler is burning, or it's off. So there is only one bit of information in there because it reflects these 2 states of the home thermostat. So bringing it to the world of consciousness. If I were a bacteria that had only one sense, only one photoreceptive cell on its membrane, and it only had two states. Either it's experiencing light or it's experiencing darkness. That's equivalent to the thermostat. So you would describe the conscious inner life of that little cell with one photoreceptive receptor with one bit of information. Now, your inner life, when you're listening to a Vivaldi sonata and watching firework displays in the night sky, as I have, by the way, when I lived in Switzerland, this happened every year. That's very, very rich, intense experience. So to describe that, you would require more states to describe that. The description would be more complicated. And what we call it is then, well, more information. So information, the amount of information is just a description. Information does not exist in and of itself. Actually, by definition, it was defined by Claude Shannon in 1948, precisely as a way to quantify the different possible states a system could take on. In other words, it didn't exist without the system. It was a way to describe the dynamics of the system. And I'm applying that to experience. It's a way to describe the richness of experience. Sam Frank, under idealism, do we distinguish between phenomenology and ontology? He could say that under idealism, the ontology is the phenomenology. Phenomenology is experience, and under idealism, experience is itself the ground of being. So you could say that these two terms get at least much closer together, with one possible exception, which I already alluded to. If you think or conceive that consciousness can come to a total, complete rest, then there would be consciousness without experience, whatever consciousness is. And then in that case, there would be an ontology, consciousness at rest, without phenomenology, without any particular experience. All right, let's go to the next slide. Get my act together again. Now, I'm going to now make a jump. We've talked about there being only experience, and therefore there is only the experiencer, because an experience is an excitation of the subject of experience. This being the most parsimonious way to interpret the clear observations that we make, that do not depend on theory or assumptions. Now I'm going to take a next step, and I'm going to argue that there is only one experiencer, and it's universal. And I'm going to argue that this is the most logical and parsimonious interpretation of the given facts of nature. Notice that the brain is made of what we call matter. Forget the definition of matter that makes it complicated. I'm just using the word in a colloquial sense now to appeal to something you're familiar with. Whatever matter is, the brain is made of it by definition. It's a material object made of atoms and force fields and so on. So because of that, now there's an interpretation. All we call matter is an extrinsic appearance of conscious inner life. Why am I saying that? We know that brain function, brain activity, a brain is the extrinsic appearance of your intrinsic conscious inner life. It's the way your conscious inner life presents itself from to outside observation, to observation from a different perspective other than your own first person perspective. And we know that what we call brain is a material object. Ergo, the matter of the brain is what your conscious inner life looks like when observed from a second or third person perspective. Right? That's all there is to it. It's an implication of how we have been interpreting things so far. The matter of your brain is what your conscious inner life looks like from an outside perspective. But notice that the atoms and force fields that constitute the brain as a material object are the very same atoms and force fields that constitute stars, planets, whole galaxies, and galaxy clusters. It's the same atoms of hydrogen, oxygen, helium, carbon. It's the same thing. It's the same electromagnetic field, strong force, weak force, gravity. It's the same stuff. So if we say that the matter of the brain is the extrinsic appearance of conscious inner life, unless we are prepared to accept a completely arbitrary discontinuity in the way we are we are looking upon nature, regarding nature, we must grant that the matter that constitutes the universe as a whole is also the extrinsic appearance of conscious inner life, even though not your individual personal conscious inner life. The point here is that what we call matter is the extrinsic appearance of conscious inner life. And that's all there is to it. There is nothing else but it. What we call matter, I will repeat it so it gets through, because I know if you're not used to this, it's difficult to internalize what I'm trying to say. Whether you agree or not, it's difficult to understand what I'm trying to say. What we call matter is what conscious inner life looks like from a second or third person perspective. And that's all there is to it. Everything else is a way to describe it. Mass, charge, momentum, spin, weight, frequency, amplitude, geometrical relationships, angles, lengths. All these are ways to describe the extrinsic appearance of conscious inner life. And that's all there is to it. That's the jump that you need to make if you are to understand what I'm trying to put across. You have to abandon the prejudices that you have inherited from culture about matter being this unconscious, self-existing thing out there that is outside all consciousness. This is an unexamined assumption, an explanatory model that we now mistake for an observation. That's what André Linde highlighted in my second slide. Let us remember that this is just a convenient explanatory model. It is not itself an observation. So I replace that explanatory model by saying that matter is what conscious inner experience looks like from an outside perspective. And everything else, all the quantities of physics, are just ways to describe this extrinsic appearance. Okay, now questions are popping very quickly. Let me see if I have some more animation. I have one, but I'll take the questions first. Okay, that relates to my previous point. Is consciousness not in complete rest in deep sleep when there is no movement, no activity of mind? I'll ask you guys, please don't type in another question yet, because there are 4 on my screen. It's the whole length of the screen. If somebody types another one, I'll start missing some questions. No. Very recently, neuroscience has revealed that during sleep, we probably continuously have experiences, sleep experiences that are distinct from dreams. We know how to identify dreams in an EEG, an electroencephalogram. And we know that we don't dream all night through. We dream about 4 or 5, maybe 6 times per night if we have a normal night's rest. And then, until very recently, we would have concluded that when we are not dreaming during sleep, we are not experiencing anything. It's just a blank, a void, a black hole. But now we know that at least to a large extent, that is not the case. During sleep, research has been done in which subjects wore a EEG cap and went to sleep in a laboratory. And neuroscientists measured their brainwave activity and on purpose identified the moments when they knew for sure the subjects were not dreaming. So based on the EEG, they knew that the sleeping person was not dreaming. And then they would wake up the subject and ask, were you having any experience? And guess what? Consistently, people would say they were having experiences. They have described this according to 3 categories. There probably are more. It's just a way to simplify that. They categorized it as sleep thinking. You actually think in a different way when you are asleep. You just don't remember what you were thinking when you wake up, unless you are brutally woken up by a neuroscientist in the middle of it. Then you do remember. If you have a natural night's sleep, you will not remember it when you wake up. You will not remember that you were having those thoughts. They were not dreams. They were thoughts. Another category is selfless experience. Experience without a center, without an explicit narrative of I, of I-ness. which they compared to what some meditators describe, an experience of the void. You may say, well, that's not an experience because it's the void. Oh, but guess what? They remember it. So they were experiencing something that they described as the void. Same thing goes for these people who were brutally woken up during sleep while they were not dreaming. They would report having this selfless experience. They had an experiential state, but not associated with an explicit sense of I-ness, of me-ness. And there was a third category, sleep perception. Even when you're not dreaming, you may be perceiving your environment. You may be hearing sounds, you may be feeling warm or cold. And these are experiences that happen during sleep while you're not dreaming. So the point I'm trying to get to finally answer your question is, we can never say that we are not experiencing things. We can only say that we don't remember having had the experience. When you wake up in the morning and you think, I slept flat for 8 hours and I had no experiences, all that you can be sure of is that you don't remember anything during those 8 hours. You cannot categorically say that you were not having an experience, because there is no difference between not having the experience or having the experience and not remembering it. They would present themselves, these two instances, these two cases, in exactly the same way. And there is a lot of neuroscientific evidence now that, in fact, you are experiencing throughout the night and throughout your life. All that happens is that these experiences are not metacognitive. Therefore, you don't form memory pathways. So it's very difficult to remember them, because while you're having them, you're not telling yourself a story about what you are experiencing, which is what we do in waking life. In waking life, we not only experience, we are constantly telling ourselves a story about what we are experiencing. I am looking at the computer screen right now, at a little hole on my camera, pretending that I see all of you on the other side of that hole. There is a whole narrative in my mind. I'm sitting in my study. There is a ventilator behind me because I'm feeling warm. Because of that narrative, I can recall all this later on. It's the narrative that helps me form the memory pathways. During sleep, your metacognition almost disappears, but not your experiencing. Because you don't tell yourself a narrative about what you're experiencing during sleep, you don't recall it afterwards. It's a very long answer. I will leave it at that. There are two more questions. So does my TV or cable have an inner life? I would say no. Your TV or your cable TV do not have a conscious inner life of their own. But I will get to this later. Yet your TV and your cable, they only exist in consciousness. I'll get to the difference soon. Martin, what is then Earth, Moon, Sun, black hole from the position outside universal consciousness? Or from inside universal consciousness? This is a good question. Martin already realized that what I'm saying implies that the Earth, the Moon, the black hole, these are all extrinsic appearances of some inner experience. So he's asking, what is that inner experience of the universe that presents itself to me as the moon, the sun, a black hole? I don't think that we can answer that. To know that, we have to die first, cease to be ourselves, and become reintegrated with a mind at large, and then we would know. We can make some guesses. The world's traditions provide some tantalizing hints about what our ancestors have intuited these things to be. I could go on a 1 hour long tear about this, so I have to police myself. What I'm saying implies that the physical world is symbolic. It doesn't exist in and of itself. It's just how something else, conscious inner life, presents itself to us. Everything that we call matter, that we call physicality, is a symbol. It's a representation of something else that can only be known from within. And we are not within it. So all we can know of it is the physical world, because that's how that inner life presents itself to us. But people have had intuitions. Dante, talk about the European tradition. Dante, in his main work, talked about the sun as the image of outpouring love. So for him, a light emitting star was the extrinsic appearance of a outpouring of love as felt from within. That's one hint in the Western tradition. I think I'll stop at this because otherwise, I mean, I wrote more than one book about this. So I'll leave it at that. And then you can ask, well, what is a thunderstorm a symbol of? What corresponds to the thunderstorm from a first-person perspective? What about the black hole? No, this is rich ground. And to be honest with you, this is one of the most interesting things for me in my own life. The fight I'm fighting right now, trying to articulate idealism and get it to become mainstream, I'm doing it because that's the best way I have to be useful. But for me, it's boring. I do not need extra convincing about the correctness of idealism, or at least about idealism being the closest to truth we have come up with so far in our history. So to talk about this and convince other people of it it's not something I do for myself. I don't need to reassure myself by convincing anybody else. I feel very serene in my convictions in this regard. I'm not close-minded. I just have a strong conviction because this conclusion has come out of 30 years of meditation and investigation, hard thinking, and so it's a very stable conclusion for me. What is interesting for me is what comes next. Once you accept idealism, and then you have to bite the implications, bite the bullet of the implications. What does it mean then if everything is the appearance of some conscious inner life? What is this world I'm living in? That is rich ground, and it's probably the best way of living a very, very meaningful and satisfying life, because everything acquires meaning. Nothing is more just that. Nothing is just what it seems to be. Everything becomes a symbol. Life becomes a symbolic book to be read and interpreted. The whole world around you is not the ultimate reality. It is pointing at something else. It's providing hints at of something else. And life becomes, like a Sherlock Holmes adventure, which may be the point of it all, actually. I'll leave it at that because I could also go on a tear here and talk hours about this. Tom Klim, it's almost as if matter is a shadow image of the mental interior reality. I wouldn't call it a shadow. I don't attribute any negative connotation to it. It's just the way things are. We've made it negative. But that's just an artifact of our particular cultural development. I think matter is wonderful. It's wondrous, even. Next one, Josh. Does this entail that the unconscious is a mislabeled concept? Absolutely. I don't think there is anything like a phenomenal unconscious. Actually, even the originators of this term, at least one of them, Carl Jung, didn't mean by it that you were not that the unconscious was not phenomenally conscious. He's very clear in his corpus about it. He talks about the unconscious having experiences. And if it has experiences, then it's not phenomenally unconscious. What Jung meant, and I wrote a book explaining this, which will come out early next year, what he meant by unconsciousness is unmetacognition. It's the lack of metacognition. It's the inability for you to recognize your own experiences in an explicit way. In other words, you are experiencing things in the unconscious. You just don't know that you are experiencing things. You are not able to tell yourself, oh, I am experiencing these things now. No, you just experience them like in an ordinary dream. And that is what Jung called unconsciousness. Today, we would call it lack of the absence of metaconsciousness, the absence of conscious metacognition. Tom Klim again, I have had a near-death experience and can personally relate some of what the mental state without the body feels like. Your philosophy is very much is a very high match to what ND experiences of late. I'm very glad to hear. I confess it's not a surprise because I have heard it from other NDers, but I'm always happy to hear this. Thanks. Yannick Bousset, do you think that people with blind sight experience sight in the same way we experience a dream? Yes, that's what I think. I think blind sight is a break in metacognition. We know that people with blind sight, people with normal sight have closed loops of communication between different brain areas, the neocortex and a more primitive brain area lower in the brain. And it is this back and forth communication between these two brain areas that allow us to not only see, but report on our seeing, report to ourselves to say, I am seeing things now. And if somebody asks, are you seeing something? We can say, yes, I am seeing something. It is that communication that enables that. And people with blind sight don't have one leg of that communication. There is no back and forth anymore. And to me, all that means is that they are having the experience of sight, but they cannot metacognize that experience. They cannot report the experience to themselves or others. They report that they can't see, but in fact they can see, and that's why they react as if they could see, because that's what people with blind sight do. They react perfectly normally. If there is an object coming at them from the side of the eye that they are supposed to have blind sight on, or coming at them and they are blind sight on both eyes, they will not report that they can see the object, but they will move out of the way, okay? So something is happening there. His question continues on. I'm possible. I only don't know how to answer the last part of your brain about people with a split brain. There is conflicting evidence about that, and I didn't go deep enough into that to have an educated opinion, so I remain agnostic about that part. Okay, guys, let me come back to this slide because we got questions about different things, not about the content of this specific slide. So just to recapitulate, the brain and its function is the extrinsic appearance of conscious inner life. It is what conscious inner life looks like from an outside perspective. That's point one. Point two, the brain is made of matter. Therefore, the matter of the brain is what intrinsic conscious inner life looks like from an extrinsic perspective. But the matter that composes the brain, constitutes the brain, is the same matter that constitutes the rest of the universe. So unless we are prepared to accept a totally arbitrary discontinuity, we must grant that all matter, not only in the brain, is the extrinsic appearance of conscious inner life. In the case of the inanimate universe, it's the appearance of universal conscious inner life. Now, to go back to a question that I did got in here, that does not mean that my cell phone, my little old iPhone 6 here, that doesn't mean that my iPhone is conscious in and of itself, in the same way that I am conscious in and of myself. Let me explain this with a metaphor. I don't think there is anything it is like to be a single neuron in my brain. There is only something it is like to be my whole brain, my whole nervous system, actually my whole body. In other words, me. There is something it is like to be the whole me, the whole body, or at least the whole nervous system inside my body. But there is nothing it's like to be a single neuron in it. I think in exactly the same way, there is something it is like to be the inanimate, non-living universe as a whole. The whole inanimate universe has a conscious inner life of its own. But that doesn't mean that a cell phone or a particular moon or a star have consciousness in and of themselves, in the same way that a single neuron in my head doesn't seem to have a consciousness in and of itself. At least I don't have access to it. I don't experience lots of little conscious inner lives. I experience one whole conscious inner life, which presents itself to you as my body, as my nervous system. Now, I'll go one step further and say, there are no such things as tables, chairs, mobile phones, or any individual material object in and of itself. The division of the inanimate world into separate objects is merely nominal. It's something we do for convenience. There are no metaphysical grounds to look upon this phone as separate from the rest of the inanimate universe. Think of it as, take a picture. If you look at the picture, and then you see some pixels are more reddish than other pixels, and you say, well, those reddish pixels are an object. But they correspond to no visible object in the picture. It's just an arbitrary delineation you made based on that criterion of choosing more reddish pixels. Or to give you an example, another maybe better example, looking around me to see if there's an example right above me. I don't know whether you see the wood here. If you look at a piece of wood, you see these little grains and these little veins. Now, these grains and veins, you don't look upon them as separate objects. They're just part of the wood. They are part of the image. They are part of what wood looks like. They don't exist in and of themselves. Only the wood does. What I'm trying to tell you is that not even the wood does. The wood itself is just a little grain, a little vein, an arbitrary delineation of a subset of a much bigger image. And that image is the inanimate universe as a whole. I mean, where does the river end and the ocean begin? If you have a rock mountain and a little rock after a storm detaches from that mountain and bouncing down the slope, did that rock become a separate object? Fundamentally separate from the mountain? Does the mere separation make it, the mere physical detachment, make it a fundamentally separate object? And if so, once it comes to rest at the bottom of the same rocky mountain and still in touch with the rest of the rocks, does it become again part of the mountain and not anymore a separate object? You see, the boundaries between objects are completely arbitrary. They are made on the basis of convenience. Even artificial objects like cars, if you say, well, I can define a car in terms of its function. Whatever I need to operate a car for the car to function is part of the car, and what's not needed is not part of the car. Now, that would be that would seem to be a reasonable way to delineate the boundary of objects in a non-arbitrary way, in a functional way. But it is arbitrary ultimately, because the car will not work without the road that the tires of the car grab in order to produce movement. The car would not work without the atmospheric air that enables combustion inside the engine, or that cools the car and prevents it from blowing and stop working. The car would not work without the gasoline that came from deep under the bowels of the earth. The car would not work without gravity, because without gravity, it wouldn't be pressed against the road, and therefore the tires wouldn't grip the road. So if you think carefully about it, there are no objects. We divide the world into separate inanimate objects merely for convenience. If I want to go and buy a car, I need to be able to refer to that subset of the inanimate world, because that's what I'm interested in. So the partition of the inanimate world into separate objects is completely nominal. And for that reason, too, there's nothing it's like to be a car. There is nothing it's like to be a mobile phone, because there are no cars, there are no mobile phones. There is only the inanimate universe as a whole. And then there is something it is like to be the inanimate universe as a whole. I think the only exception to this is life. Life is the extrinsic appearance of dissociation in universal mind, in universal consciousness. And that's the only objective criterion of delineation, of separation. I'll get to that in a couple of slides. I'm getting more questions. But let me just finish this slide. The clincher for this slide was this. If matter is always the extrinsic appearance of conscious inner life, and as far as our conscious inner life is concerned, that matter configures itself in the form we call a nervous system, neurons interconnected with each other in a particular way and in an identifiable way. So what about the matter that constitutes the inanimate universe as a whole? Shouldn't it have more or less the same patterns? Well, not necessarily, at least not in principle. It could look like anything else because life is a particular phenomenon within the universe. However, as it turns out, it does look the same. At a universal level, matter organizes itself in ways that are surprisingly reminiscent of the way matter in our brains organizes itself. You have the same network and juncture patterns, communication patterns. And it's not only an image, and you can objectively study the topology of the universe at its largest scales based on information theory, which are objective methods, not just appearance. You can make two things completely different look like each other if you, crop the image in the right way and so forth. But in this case, there is no room for that. These are objective information theoretical analysis. And it is surprising how much the structure of the inanimate universe at its largest scales corresponds to the structure of a nervous system. And nobody has an explanation, a scientific explanation for that today, which doesn't mean that we will not have. But even if we do have, I would still interpret it the same way. Matter is what conscious inner life looks like. That's why the inanimate universe as a whole looks like a little brain, a dissociated part of universal mind. And therefore, they configure themselves in the same way because they are the appearance of the same intrinsically similar phenomenon, conscious inner life. Now I will take some questions. Why does the universal consciousness manifest itself in this way? Is it trying to achieve something? Why do storms form? Why does the sun shine bright and warm? Why does the earth go around the sun? It's nature, and what it does is a direct consequence of what it is. And why it is what it is not a valid question. There is no reason for the ultimate existent to be what it is. It just is, because that's what exists. You can explain why its patterns of behavior are the way they are, but fundamentally the laws of physics themselves, what they describe, are reflections of what the universe is, what universal consciousness is. Now, I'm answering it in this way because that's one perspective. Having said that, I understand what's motivating your question. It seems like it's crazy for a conscious mind to give rise to a world of suffering. I mean, all life suffers. Life eats life alive. Just watch lions do that in the Serengeti. It's a unfathomably, how to find words, adjectives to describe it. It's a gory spectacle. It's suffering of an extent that is difficult to fathom. And none of us is a complete stranger to that. We suffer in different degrees, but we all have a pretty good idea of how bad suffering can be. Why would universal mind do that to itself? I don't think it's deliberate. I don't think it has planned to do it. I think it's dreaming. Just like when we dream at night, we don't choose our dreams, but we dream them up anyway. Dreams are a manifestation of that which we are. They are what they are because we are what we are. And I think the universe and life is just that. It's a manifestation of universal consciousness. It may be, and I believe it is, instinctively trying to get a grip on itself. In the same way that, if somebody wakes you up in the middle of the night, for the first 30 seconds, you're sort of groggy, you're not sure what's going on, you're confused, you're trying to get a grip until your metacognition reasserts itself. And then oh yeah, I am this person, I live in this place, I was asleep, I remember what I did yesterday, now I'm awake for this and that reason, and this is what I have to do. In other words, when you recover your metacognitive context, then you get a grip. But in those intermediary 30 seconds, you're very confused because you don't have your metacognitive context. Now, I think universal consciousness beyond life, beyond us, is not metacognitive. And in that sense, I think it's confused. But it is experiencing things, and it experiences things that are pleasant and things that are not pleasant. Or, it's comfortable sometimes and uncomfortable other times, or an unfathomable combination of the two that is way beyond our ability to even conceive. But we can imagine that it's experiencing all polarities in the same way we do, pleasure and pain, delight and suffering. but it's instinctive. So it's confused in that process. It's trying to get a grip, just like you try to get a grip when somebody suddenly wakes you up in the middle of the night. You go like, oh, wait, what's going on? What am I doing? I think it's doing that. And the result is this is what's happening right now. That's the result of that metacognitively deficient confusion, but a felt confusion, which provides impetus for action. And yeah, there is action all around us. The universe is doing something, it's evolving, it's going somewhere. It's apparently trying something, even if it's not deliberate and planned out. Another question, could we say that the universe is an extrinsic appearance of God's conscious inner life or God's mind, provided that we accept the notion of God, of course? Yes, I think we could say that. Actually, I can quote Nisargadatta Maharaj, an Indian sage from the 20th century. He wrote, well, he said it, somebody wrote it for him. He said, to see the world is to see God. There is no seeing God apart from the world. To see God beyond the world is to be God. And I think I quoted it correctly, word for word. Because it's a quote that in very few words completely and accurately encapsulates what I've been trying to tell you for the past hour. The physical world, the inanimate universe, is the appearance of God's inner life, if you accept the concept of God. I am very careful about it because I never know what people will interpret, how people will interpret this word, what they will think I'm saying. So I try to avoid the word and stick to more neutral terms, but I'll go along with you there. If the inanimate universe is how God's inner life presents itself to me, then to see the world is to see God. There is no seeing God apart from the world, except that you have God's first person perspective, that which the physical world is an image of. How does it feel to have God's first person perspective? Well, to see God apart from the world is to be God. In other words, you need to be it in order to have the intrinsic point of view as opposed to the extrinsic appearance. Next one from Simon. So is universal consciousness like a dream experience? The whole of the dream material world appears while I sleep and is made of my mind. Is this similar in the way consciousness works? Universal consciousness. I'm not sure it's very similar. And the reason is this. The symbols that appear in our nightly dreams. I mean, when we dream at night, as you say here, we dream of tables, chairs, other people, trees, moons and planets and black holes, if you are a cosmologist. And these are things that we've become first acquainted with in waking life. In other words, they were the images that we see from across our dissociative boundary. They were the extrinsic appearance of the conscious inner life of others and of the universe as a whole, of God himself or herself or itself. So we take that learning first, and then we sort of recombine those symbols in our dreaming mind at night. However, I'll continue to use the word God. No, universal consciousness is the word you use. Universal consciousness is not us. By definition, it is that part of universal mind that is not me, is not you, is not a living being. So it didn't have that learning. It didn't experience the material world you and I experience. Because the material world is its extrinsic appearance. It's not available, that appearance is not available to itself. In the same way that the patterns of your brain activity are not available to you. They're only available to the neuroscientist that's using a machine. We can see our bodies with a mirror, but since universal consciousness is all there is, it doesn't have a mirror outside itself. So it cannot experience itself from an outside perspective, except through us. And we are who we are. So we have those dreams. I don't think universal consciousness has dreams of stars and waterfalls and trees, because this symbology was not available to it. it's extrinsic symbology. All it has is its intrinsic perspective, is its feelings, is its abstract thoughts, its emotions, its sense of comfort or discomfort, endogenous experiences. And then might it dream in terms of that? Surely, I think the inanimate universe is the extrinsic appearance of that dream. But it's not a dream of moons, planets, black holes, waterfalls, and other people. It's a dream that we cannot fathom. As a matter of fact, the closest thing to what we call moons and waterfalls and you know, this physical thing, the closest thing to it from the perspective, the first person perspective of the remainder of universal consciousness or mind at large, would be what our conscious inner life looks like from its perspective. And its perspective is not your perspective. You also have an external perspective into my inner life, and you see a physical body. But the perspective of universal consciousness is not quite like yours, because it's surrounding me and you and all the other living beings. It doesn't have this perspective that you and I have, a view from a particular angle. It has a unifying, holistic view. And the way all of our conscious inner lives of all living beings would present themselves as a unified whole to universal consciousness would be the closest analogy to it, to what we experience as the physical universe. But I don't think it's fathomable. We can conceive of it conceptually, but we cannot fathom what it must feel like. To fathom it, you have to experience it. And to experience it, as Nisargadatta said, you have to be God. Then you will be God again when you die, when the dissociation ends. Or perhaps not. Perhaps you fall back into some other intermediary level of dissociation. I don't know. Alexandra Villas-Boas. Okay, but then now I have got to ask, objects can come to existence for us because we are part of one same species. But how does AI start to recognize, or in other words, bring matter to existence in the same way if AI is also symbolic reality? Your question is the answer. AI doesn't, AI doesn't do that. AI doesn't have a conscious inner life in and of itself. What we call an AI, just like a mobile phone or a waterfall or a moon, is a arbitrary delineation of a holistic image that we call the inanimate universe as a whole. There is no such a thing as an AI conscious in and of itself. An AI is a tool. It is intelligent because intelligence is an objective property. You can measure it. It's about clever data processing. But that data processing in and of itself is not accompanied by private inner life the way the data processing in my brain and in your brain is. So I don't think an AI brings the physical world into existence the same way we do by virtue of being dissociated alters of universal consciousness. I'm going to talk about that soon. Matthew, I wouldn't want to play a computer game that was too easy. It wouldn't be satisfying. Do you feel this offers us an insight into suffering? I don't know. I don't feel that that's the case, because what you're suggesting here is that suffering is premeditated. That there is a plan. God has decided to put himself through it, through us, which resonates with the Christian mythology. And from that perspective, I don't dismiss it. I think mythologies that have conquered the hearts and minds of 2 billion people are not dismissible. They're resonating with something very deep, very intrinsic within us. So the idea of God incarnating in the form of Jesus premeditatedly, in a premeditated way, may have something to it. But my personal feeling is that suffering is not premeditated. It didn't come out of a plan to say, well, I'm bored, so let's suffer now to bring some color to life. I don't think that. I think suffering can reach extremes that are unknown to me and you or anybody that has the resources to be taking part in this event. It can reach depths of agony that no deliberate conscious being would choose to put itself through. That's my own intuition. So I think suffering arises from confusion, not from boredom. But that's my own view. I don't dismiss the view you are representing here. Frank, can we get your definition of metacognition within the framework of idealism? Metacognition is the recognition of your own experiential state. In other words, when you not only experience something, but you know that you are experiencing it. This knowledge that you are experiencing something comes in addition to the original experience. It comes on top of it. So the original experience is merely a phenomenal state, and a metacognitive state is also a phenomenal one, but a phenomenal one that points at another phenomenal state. It's the conscious knowledge of a lower level experience. That's how I could describe it. I don't have the freedom to define it under idealism, because there is a proper definition of metacognition that I'm just using. I can interpret it under idealism, and that's what I just did. Another Frank, Sam Frank, do you attribute consciousness to plants, animals, and babies? Yes, I think every living being, and by that I mean a metabolizing organism, has a conscious in life of its own, in the same way that you and I have a private consciousness in our life of our own. Maybe the conscious inner life of plants is very simple, but I do think they have a conscious inner life of their own, dissociated from the inanimate universe. I think all life has. I think metabolism, biology, is what dissociated conscious inner life looks like. It's how it presents itself to outside observation. That's what life is, in my view. All right, let's continue. So we have seen that there are two perspectives of experience. They're both experiential, but one is intrinsic, and the other one is also ultimately intrinsic, but it correlates with an intrinsic view. So I will call it the extrinsic appearance of an inner experience. Why are there these two perspectives? If all that's going on are the excitations or patterns of vibration of one universal consciousness, why are there two perspectives? When I am dreaming, there doesn't seem to be two perspectives. The people I dream of don't have a perspective of their own. They're just symbols arising in my own dream. Now, I know some of you would say, well, maybe the beings that appear in our dreams do have a conscious inner life of their own. Maybe, perhaps. But I don't see very compelling reasons to grant that. And even if there are, surely many, if not all, at least many of the living beings we experience in our dreams are only that. They consist of nothing more than what we experience. They are merely hollow images that our mind creates for itself. So why isn't universal consciousness dreaming in an analogous way? There is only a first-person perspective, only an intrinsic perspective, not an extrinsic one. So why do these two perspectives emerge? That's what I'll try to answer. Now, let me just do a time check. We have 40 minutes still. Let me go through some slides, because I need rhythm and pace in this part of the presentation. Otherwise, I will lose you. So I will answer questions again at the end, and then we'll spend all time answering questions. Here's my argument. In the beginning, and I'm saying that rather metaphorically, maybe literally, but metaphorically too, in the beginning, there was only one universal consciousness that was integrated. It had ideas and emotions. In other words, endogenous experiential states, not perceptual ones. It could not have perceptual experiences because it was all there is. There is nothing beyond it to be perceived. There was only it. So all its experiential states were endogenous, which we relate to ideas and emotions. I mean, even if you are in an ideal sensory deprivation chamber and you have no perception whatsoever, you would still experience your ideas, your thoughts, and your emotions, because these are endogenous experiential states that arise independently of perception. So that's how it all began. That's the original state or the base state, whatever you want to call it. And then it underwent something that we know happens in mental space. Empirically, we know this phenomenon called dissociation. For the past 10 years, we have known that it's a reality thanks to neuroimaging research. One mental space can seemingly break itself up into seemingly distinct segments. And each of these segments has experiences of its own, of their own. A person with dissociative identity disorder can have multiple disjoint personalities or centers of experience, and each has its own memories, proclivities, desires, fears, preferences that are not associated with the inner life of the others. So we know dissociation happens, whatever it is, we know it happens in mental space. So I'm taking that hint and saying, well, universal consciousness itself at the cosmic level underwent dissociation. And dissociation entails the formation of a boundary that you see here, an inner boundary within universal consciousness. And within that boundary, there are experiential states, like ideas and emotions, that are dissociated from the outside ideas and emotions. They do not evoke each other. They're all experienced simultaneously, but there are no associative bridges between them. Now, the moment this happens and you create this boundary, the phenomenal states or the experiential states outside the boundary can impinge on the boundary. And we can all relate to what I mean here. Imagine weak, non-pathological forms of dissociation that we all experience. I will give you an example that has been very significant for me in my life. You may relate to that more or less depending on whether you recognize it. I have for well over 2 decades now worked in the cutthroat world of high-tech corporate strategy. And I have also underwent, how to say, pungent experiences in life, which I had to bear while I carried out my work. I've been through a divorce. I've been through very bad phases in life. I have thought even of ending my life a couple of times because of an excruciating health condition that is not fatal, but turns your life into a living hell. And if you're curious, I'll tell you what it is. I have a rare, very, very strong form of tinnitus, ringing in the ear. I've made peace with it now. I have had 2 very bad bouts of tinnitus because of acoustic accidents. One of them was because of an acoustic accident. The other one was because of an ear infection. And it was very hard. Divorce was very hard. So we all go through these very hard things in our lives, and yet we have to wake up in the morning and go to work. In the cutthroat world of high-tech corporate strategy, which demands absolute focus. So what happened was that I've compartmentalized this. I've set those feelings, that suffering aside. I've compartmentalized them so I could carry on during my day. And that is a form of dissociation. Compartmentalization is the name we give to a largely voluntary form of dissociation. We welcome that form of dissociation. And from the point of view of the executive ego, we stop feeling the suffering. We stop feeling that which is afflicting us. Another part of us does feel it. A dissociated part of us keeps on feeling it. And you know that after the fact. At the end of the day, you come back home and you allow the dissociative boundaries to dissolve and you realize, I was going to say a bad word in English, but this is being recorded. I almost said it in German as an alternative, but I figured some of you will understand that anyway. And we realize that you've been suffering all day, although you've compartmentalized that. But during the day, the executive ego doesn't feel the suffering. Another part of you does. And that other part of you, and finally I come to the point, that other part of you impinges on the executive ego. And you think you've compartmentalized it well, but you didn't. It's still impinging on you. It's setting the tone for your thoughts. If you have dissociated suffering, your thoughts acquire a negative tone. You become pessimistic. It sets the tone of your impetus, what you feel like doing. In my case, I feel like finishing my tasks as soon as possible. At least that's how I felt, because of that dissociated suffering in the background. So although the suffering itself is dissociated and the executive ego does not feel it directly, it impinges on the executive ego and leaves a footprint that you register in your impetus, in what you feel like doing or not doing, in the line your thoughts take. It's a negative line or a positive line. So there is impingement. And that's what I mean by these little orange arrows here. Dissociation eliminates the associative bridges you have to experiences that are now compartmentalized away, but those dissociated experiences still impinge on you. Now, and that's the key point. This is the most important part of the day, perhaps. What I argue is that evolution has constructed us in such a way that the impingement of those exterior, dissociated, transpersonal experiential states on us is experienced by us as perception. What we see, what we hear, what we taste, what we feel with our skin, what we smell, is the impingement of external experiential states on our dissociative boundary. And what our dissociative boundary looks like is the skin of our body, our eyes, our ears, our sense organs, which are all on the surface of that which we consider to be ourselves, on the surface of our body. They are what our dissociative boundary looks like in perception. And perception is essentially the impingement of dissociated transpersonal experiential states on that dissociative boundary. That's why we talk of perception as photons impinging on our retina, as organic molecules impinging on the mucous lining of our nose, in other words, smell, as organic molecules impinging on the surface of our tongue, in other words, taste, as molecular vibrations in the air impinging on our eardrum, in other words, our hearing. So perception is the impingement of transpersonal experiential states on our dissociative boundary. And our dissociative boundary appears in perception as our skin and other sense organs. You see how it all comes together. It all ties together. If you ignore for the moment what you see, what you hear, ignore the physical world, and you think only conceptually, perception is the impingement of transpersonal experiential states on the boundary of our altar. Now, if you allow yourself to think in terms of that perception, then perception is the impingement of molecules, air vibrations, and photons on the surface of our body, particularly our skin and sense organs. I'm saying the same thing in two different ways. One, a conceptual one, the other one, a perceptual one. And I explain perception in perceptual terms by talking of air molecules and photons and molecules impinging on the surface of our body. But in and of itself, its inner nature, what it actually is, perception is the impingement of transpersonal experiential states onto our dissociative boundary. If you internalize this, if you grok this and you internalize this, you are there. you will have seen through the veil of materialism, through the confusion of materialism. The confusion of materialism is to take the symbology on the screen of perception, the way that impingement presents itself to us, because nature has favored the evolution of our sense organs. So you would acquire information about the outside world and stand a better chance to survive and reproduce. Materialism confuses that appearance with the thing in itself. The thing in itself are transpersonal experiential states beyond our dissociative boundary, impinging on our dissociative boundary. That's the thing in itself. And the thing in itself presents itself on the screen of perception as molecules, air vibrations, and photons impinging on the surface of our body. It's two different ways of talking about the same thing. Now, let me continue while I am on a roll here. What we call a body is the extrinsic appearance of that dissociation. And I'll show this, let me illustrate this graphically. There is universal consciousness, that's how it starts, and it dissociates. So let's say it dissociates into two alters, actually three, because universal consciousness itself, the remaining segment of it, will itself be an alter, a special alter that I usually call mind at large. The segment of universal consciousness that is not in an ordinary alter. In other words, it's not encapsulated in what we call a living organism. But strictly speaking, that is also an alter. But having made this disclaimer, there are two ordinary alters, 1 and 2, two living beings. Now we've seen, let me accelerate this. We've seen that there is impingement, from the transpersonal states in universal consciousness onto the boundary of an alter. And that looks like the physical world out there. We've seen that. But this impingement works the other way around as well, of course. The dissociated inner experiential states of alter 2 also impinge on the boundary from within the boundary. And that is also registered by the transpersonal experiential states of mind at large in here, which then impinge on the boundary of alter 1, and alter 1 will register that series of two impingements from alter 2 to universal consciousness or mind at large, and from mind at large into alter 1. It will register this series of two impingements as what we call the physical body of alter 2. Alter 2, through impingement from inside to outside, leaves an imprint on universal consciousness. And that imprint impinges on alter 1, which then registers that second impingement as the image we call another living being. So when I'm talking to you and I see your body, what I am seeing is the extrinsic appearance, the symbol, the image of your inner life impinging on our common shared environment, which in turn impinges on my inner life. And the result of that is my seeing your physical living body, and the other way around as well. Again, if you understand this, you will see through the mistakes of materialism. You see where materialism makes wrong assumptions that lead to these insoluble problems, like the hard problem of consciousness, or the combination problem of panpsychism, and so on and so forth. If you understand this, you understand that all matter is what experiential states look like from across one or more dissociative boundaries. And that's all there is to it. There is nothing more to it. What we call matter is what experiential states look like from across one or more dissociative boundaries. End of story. Everything else is a way to describe that image. Matter, charge, mass, charge, momentum, spin, amplitude, frequency, geometrical relationships. All these quantities are ways to describe what matter is. And what matter is the appearance of experiential states, conscious inner life, from across at least one dissociative boundary. The inanimate matter of the universe is the appearance of God's inner life. In other words, the appearance of God's experiential states from across one dissociative boundary, namely my dissociative boundary, which presents itself to my perception as my body, my eyes, my ears, my skin, and so forth, that boundary. And another living organism is the appearance of dissociated experiential states of another alter as they impinge onto mind at large, which in turn impinges on the boundary of my alter. So all matter, living or non-living, is the extrinsic appearance of experiential states as perceived from across a dissociative boundary. Perception itself is experience from across a dissociative boundary. That's what gives rise to the entire material world, which doesn't include, of course, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions. They are immaterial because these are things that are not being presented to me on my screen of perception. They are internal experiential states, endogenous experiential states that don't go across my dissociative boundary. So I cannot grasp them directly. That's how they don't appear material, because material is, by definition, that which presents itself from across a dissociative boundary. For me, and according to analytic idealism, and I'm talking me, not because I'm very big on owning this, I don't know. These are how this stuff was already explained by many other people for at least a couple of thousand years. I say me because I don't want to commit the mistake of attributing this position to somebody else. Because somebody else might complain. I don't want to attribute this to all idealists, because if they hear this, they may say, no, Bernardo, you know, keep this to yourself. This is your view, it's not mine. Don't hijack the term idealism for all that. That's the only reason I keep on making this disclaimer. There's a question from Sam Frank. Are gods, demons, egregores, split personalities, aliens, etc., are all these things dissociated from various levels of consciousness? Is a clean hierarchy of these beings possible, perhaps across higher dimensions? Is each of us a dissociation within a dissociation within a dissociation, etc.? My answer, perhaps. I do not see any logical or empirical reason to eliminate this possibility. But I see little empirical or logical reason to consider this possibility the most likely one. I know of at least one person who would, if he didn't feel that he needed to preserve his image as an objective scientist, that person would embrace what you said and say, definitely, yes, what we call gods, demons, daimons, which is the original term, and doesn't have the connotation of being bad. The aliens that some people experience during the so-called alien abduction phenomenon, which is a terrible way to describe what is most likely an authentic psychic phenomenon. This person would say, yes, these are dissociated personalities with an inner life of their own. And the person I'm talking about is Carl Jung, the psychiatrist. Many others probably would agree. I am a lot more cautious about it, because I don't think that if you experience a living being during your dream, I don't think that there necessarily is something it is like to be that being of your dream. I think you have an inner life of your own. I think you are more than what you than how you appear to me in the form of your body. I know that behind the image, your body, that image on my screen of perception that I call your body, I know that behind that image, there is your intrinsic perspective. There is your first person perspective. There is something it is like to be behind that image. In other words, you. So I think there is a you behind that image. But during a dream, I don't think that necessarily all the people that appear in my dream are more than the image in my dream. I don't think there necessarily is something that is like to be a person that appears in my dream. I think my mind may be conjuring up that image by itself, and there's nothing behind it. There isn't an intrinsic aspect behind it. It's just a symbolic image that my mind conjured up for itself, and that being the dream process. So I think at least not all things that appear to have an inner life of their own, at least not all of them actually have an inner life of their own. I can close my eyes right now and conjure up a pink elephant. But I don't think there is anything it is like to be that pink elephant that I've just conjured up. I think the pink elephant of my imagination exists only insofar as what I imagine. There is nothing behind it in the way that there is something behind your image if you were to stand in front of me right now. So I am more cautious. I think to answer your question, finally, yes, it is possible. There is nothing in analytic idealism that precludes that possibility. I even think some hierarchical levels of dissociation are likely. And I say that on empirical grounds. We know a person, which is a dissociated complex of universal consciousness. We know a person can sub-dissociate. And we call that dissociative identity disorder. So there might be other dissociative levels above us which do not present themselves in the form of what we call physicality, simply because evolution didn't find an advantage for us to perceive those dissociative levels. In other words, they didn't influence our survival at all. So we didn't evolve our sense organs in such a way as to capture those extra hierarchical levels. I think this is likely, but I definitely do not think that every living being you or mythical creature you hallucinate or dream of or daydream of, I don't think it is a necessity that they all exist in and of themselves, having an inner life of their own. I think at least in many, many, many cases, perhaps the vast majority of cases, they only exist insofar as you're dreaming them up or hallucinating them or imagining them. Now the question, let me just, I promised I wouldn't take questions, but I am ending up taking, I'll take one more and then we'll leave it to the end. Is universal consciousness operating at a fifth or higher dimension where the passage of time isn't as important as it is to us? Talking about fifth dimension is very loaded because of what the New Age movement has done with the term. I have no idea what people mean when they talk about fifth dimensions and ascended masters and all that stuff. I don't know what they mean. So I don't necessarily endorse any of that. I do think, though, along with Schopenhauer and Kant, that time and space are categories of perception. In other words, they don't exist out there. They're not objective. They are just the scaffolding of our perceptual apparatus. And by that, I don't mean something physical. I mean a topology, a structure of consciousness that has configured itself in a such a way, in a certain way, in order to gather information about what is beyond the dissociative boundary. I think time and space are the scaffolding of this structure. In other words, they exist in us, but not out there. They are our way to make sense of what is out there, to lay it out at a glance, like an instrument panel for what is really out there. What's really out there is not the dials on that instrument panel. Evolution just created these dials because it helped us survive. And time and space is part of this trick. These are categories of perception. They are not out there. So, so what is really out there, you cannot accurately think of it in temporal or spatial terms. But it is impossible for a human being, at least for a Western mind in the 21st century, to think coherently outside time and space. Time and space have become intrinsic to our language, intrinsic to our way of thinking. So it is impossible to coherently say anything about what might exist beyond time and space. Our logic already entails time and space built right into it. So I cannot logically say anything that will make sense to you beyond time and space. I can only say that whatever appears within the scaffolding of time and space is a spatio-temporal symbol of something atemporal, aspatial. As such, it is not spatio-temporal in and of itself, but it does convey something valid about that atemporal, aspatial thing out there. In other words, this is not only an illusion. There is a correspondence between what appears in time and space and what is really out there. We do not know what that correspondence is, but whatever is out there presents itself to us according to the scaffolding of time and space. So there is validity to what we perceive, to what we think. There is validity to our rationality, to our logic. It's not the ultimate truth. It cannot be, because it's spatio-temporally constrained, and what is really out there, which is the ultimate, is outside space and time. So it's not the ultimate truth, but it's perhaps the penultimate truth. It is pointing at the ultimate truth the best way we can articulate. And as such, it's valid. It's just not ultimate. And we should not confuse these two things. We should not confuse ultimate truth with something that is valid. The ultimate is not the only valid thing. In the same way that a piece of text is valid, although it isn't what it is describing. A piece of text is just ink on paper, but it's describing something. It's pointing at something that is true. In the exact same way, I think the spatio-temporal scaffolding of perception is valid in the same way that paper and ink are valid, but they're not ultimate in the sense that both are pointing at something beyond themselves. One more question: could the black hole be another dissociative identity or consciousness, a universe within another universe? These are two very different questions that you're conflating. I don't think a black hole is a dissociative identity. Could it be the doorway to another universe? Yes, it could. Okay, we try to finish now. Diagnosing universal consciousness's dissociative identity disorder. You know, there was this study done here in the Netherlands by Jolanda Schlumpf and her team. They did brain imaging of people with DID, dissociative identity disorder, and they used controls. The controls were actors pretending to have DID, and they were pretending to themselves. They tried to think like a person with dissociative identity disorder. And those were the controls, and there was a bunch of people who actually were diagnosed with DID. And they wanted to see whether there would be a difference in brain imaging, because otherwise, you know, you could say that these people are pretending to have a condition. This condition doesn't exist. And guess what? There was a difference. The patterns of brain activity of the actors were very different from those of the people diagnosed with DID. In other words, there is something DID looks like from an external perspective. There is something dissociation in a human being looks like from an external perspective. There is an extrinsic appearance of dissociation from across its own dissociative boundary. And they have measured it, and they have made pictures of it. And I'm showing here two of one picture seen in two different angles. This is the image of human dissociation from across a dissociative boundary. Now, if life is itself a form of dissociation, it should also have an image within a universal context. As we talked about, the universe at its largest scales looks a bit like a nervous system. Actually, from an information and theoretical perspective, it looks very much like a nervous system in a surprising way. There's nothing we know of that would force this to be the case. So within this universal nervous system, DID should also look like something. And my point is, yes, it does. And what it looks like is us. It's life. It's life from bacteria to us, to dolphins, whales, and elephants. That's what dissociative processes within universal consciousness look like, in a way analogous to how dissociative processes in the brain of a person with DID looks like in a brain scanner. The only difference is that in our case, we are inside the brain. We are inside the universe. We don't need a brain scanner. We just need to look around. And when we look around and we see other people, we are diagnosing universal consciousness's DID. So to summarize it all reality is a play of consciousness in consciousness. These are patterns of excitation in consciousness and topological features of consciousness. Dissociation, in other words, it's the way consciousness contorts itself that gives rise to dissociation and its patterns of excitation across dissociative boundaries. So what we call empirical reality is an alter's view of the experiential states outside the alter. That's the definition of empirical reality, or the interpretation of empirical reality under analytic idealism. Living creatures are an alter's view of other dissociative processes, or its own dissociative processes, in the sense that we can look down and see our own bodies because nature has configured us to have the possibility of doing that. All processes within universal consciousness are experiential. Some I call intrinsic, some I call extrinsic, but they are all experiential. So it's all a play of experiences, organized according to certain topologies and patterns of excitation, but these are all experiences. Therefore, experience alone is enough to explain our reality. You do not get more parsimonious than that. And remember how I started. Ultimately, there is nothing to experience but the experiencer, because experiences are patterns of excitation of the experiencer. Like a dance is a movement of the dancer, like a ripple is a movement of water. Experience is a movement of the experiencer. Therefore, all reality can be made sense of in terms of one universal consciousness. That's all there is. Everything else is reducible to it. Much of it that people think is complicated is trivially reducible to it, as I hope to have convinced you. And with that, we explain all the observations we started from. So here we go full circle and go back to the beginning. I started this by listing 3 reasons why we tend to think that consciousness is in here and out there is no consciousness. So I'll go back to those observations and make sense of them under this view that only consciousness exists. Brain function correlates with inner experience. Of course, our body is what our inner experience looks like from across the dissociative boundary. So of course, brain function correlates with inner experience. Brain function is what inner experience looks like from a certain perspective. It correlates with it because it's what it looks like. It's the image of it. We all seem to share the same world. And we do. We share a world of transpersonal thoughts and emotions, of transpersonal endogenous experiential states. We are all immersed in that mental world. And that's why we describe our world in consistent ways, because our perceptual apparatuses were made to sort of provide us with information about that transpersonal mental world so we can survive better within it. So yes, we share the same world. It's just that this world is not essentially physical. Physicality is just how this world appears on the screen of perception. That's the interpretation of physicality under analytic idealism. The physical is what the transpersonal mental looks like when registered on the screen of perception, the screen of perception. Physicality is the appearance of a transpersonal shared mental world. And finally, where is my next? Finally, we observed that the laws of nature, the way the universe works, doesn't seem to depend on our whimsical wishes, desires, and preferences. I mean, I can't change the laws of nature by wishing them to be different. I don't think the inanimate universe cares about what I prefer it to be like or how to behave. It just does what it does. Why? Why can't we change our reality with an act of volition? Well, because we are dissociated from it. It is conceivable, and now I'm going into dangerous ground, but I was forced to do it the other day by an interviewer who was fond of the law of attraction. And my prickly self immediately, put out my prickles and like, oh, I'm not touching this lion even with a 10-foot pole. But then I had to confess. So first I was like, none of what I'm saying gives any support whatsoever to the idea that your affirmations will change your reality. And it doesn't. And I stand by that. I am not substantiating some flaky, loose ideas. If the laws of physics will not change because we wish them to be different. Because we are dissociated. And the image of that dissociation is life. That dissociation will only end by definition when we die, because death is the end of the dissociation. So yes, maybe you will be able to have some influence on what's going on after you're dead, which doesn't help very much. But I will grant, and I granted this to him, so I'll repeat to you now for the sake of full disclosure and honesty. It is conceivable that under certain meditative states that are very unlike the ego self, it is conceivable that your deepest, innermost beliefs and expectations may have an influence on what happens. It is conceivable. Do I see much in the way of empirical evidence to justify a belief in that proposition? No, no. Do I see some anecdotal evidence that this perhaps might be the case, even though I'm not going to promote it? Yes, there is some anecdotal evidence that if you have hidden what we would call unconscious, and we mean non-metacognitive, deeply ingrained expectations and beliefs, it is conceivable that things may unfold in a way that somewhat acquiesces to that. That is conceivable. But these will not be affirmations, because affirmations are by definition things that you're very metacognitive about, or cognitive of. And you're making those affirmations to the mirror. In other words, they are really in your ego self. They are well within the boundaries of your dissociation. They're not going away. They're not going out. They cannot influence the world out there because you're keeping that inside. I think it's conceivable that there is some influence when you truly let go of it, or when you have a belief that you're not metacognitive of, when you have a very, very, very sincere, very, very, very spontaneous expectation that you're not metacognitive of, and you don't even report it to yourself. You just instinctively, spontaneous, have that expectation deep within your self, way beyond the reach of metacognitive introspection. And then it is conceivable that that may percolate through the porousness of the dissociative boundary and have some influence out there. So I'll leave it at that. I think this is my last slide. Let me just go through this last one, and I will answer the question that just popped up. Is this scientifically substantiated? Well, you know, Nature has published an essay by Richard Conhenry back in 2005, in which he says outright, the universe is mental. Stop the nonsense. Stop the bull crap. The universe is immaterial. Live and enjoy. And he had a bunch of empirical reasons coming from physics to have that position. There is a bunch of empirical evidence from physics and from neuroscience, much of which I was going to explain next. There are a lot of slides that I will not have time to go through today, so I will leave it today here, and we will continue next time. That was not the original plan, but I took a lot of questions today, so we will eat away into question time next time so I can finish this slide set. Let me just do a time check. We have 1 minute, so I'll try to answer the questions quickly. If the universal consciousness, the ID, is a disorder, disease, would the ultimate cure be the end of the altered human life as we know it? I don't see it as a disorder. I don't see it as a disease. I think looking upon dissociation as a disease is a culture-bound conception. Dissociation is just a natural phenomenon, like a storm, like the rain. Like the sun, I know, emitting photons. It happens in nature. Dissociation happens. I don't see it as a disease. I don't think it's a disease in humans. It's certainly a very unpleasant condition that should be treated if it's making you uncomfortable. And as such, it could be looked upon as a disease. But at a universal level, it's certainly not a disease. It's just what happens. It's just what happens in nature. Now, disease or not, if universal level dissociation would end, then by definition, human life and all life as we know it would end, because life is the image of dissociation. So if dissociation ends, life ends. Death is the image of the end of dissociation, in my view. That's why I worry about death, because I'm very, very, very convinced and convinced in a very serene way. I'm convinced in a way that is calm and quiet. I'm not trying to convert anybody to that. I think it's useful if I try to make my case, but my conviction is serene, and that is that experiential inner life continues. Therefore, I am afraid of death, because there is an experiential unknown on the other end of dissociation. And if a psychedelic experience is anything to go by, we know that ego dissolution hurts. If you have done it, you know what I mean. If you haven't, nothing I can say can convey to you what it is like. I think this audience has some experience with that. Ego dissolution is tough. So I think the ultimate ego dissolution would be tough for a time, if time existed at that level. It doesn't. So, but there is something that corresponds to time at that level. So I will use the concept of time. For a while, in the process of death, I think it gets tough. So I'm afraid of that. Bernardo, who or what is the experiencer? Is that the dissociated alter, or is it the universal consciousness, or both? There is only one experiencer. But that experiencer constructs narratives of individuality because it becomes dissociated internally. A person with the ID is one subject, is one person, but that person acquires many concurrent dissociated alters. As Schopenhauer said, the eye that looks out from every alter is the same eye. And I'm being deliberately ambiguous here. It could be the I, the letter I, the me, or it could be the I, the E-Y-E, the I that looks out from every creature. Schopenhauer said, it's the same I that looks out from every creature. And that I is the same I, the same experiencer, the same subject. And what changes are the experiencers, which then leads the fragments of that single subject into constructing a narrative of separateness and self-identity. If you and I were both in an ideal sensory deprivation chamber, and for at least a moment we would both become completely amnesic, what it is like to be me would be identical to what it is like to be you, and we would be effectively the exact same I. And it's that exact same I that looks out to the world from behind my eyes, from behind your eye, from behind the eyes of my cats. The problem is that in our case, we've constructed a narrative of self-identity. There's still several more questions. I mean, what do we do? Do we continue next time, or do we want to continue? I can continue for a few more minutes.
Yeah, it's up to you. We're recording it, so I know some people sometimes have to leave bang on time, and we're recording this and we can send it out. So if you see any of these questions you really want to hear the answers, assuming the recordings worked, then we'll send those out. And then other than that, Bernardo, it's up to you. You've already performed a tour de force or symphony as far as I'm concerned. So if when you want to take a rest, and we do have 2 more sessions for exactly that reason, there will be lots of questions.
Yeah, I'm concerned just with the people who have to leave. It would be unfair to them. So what I will do is the following. I'll give you 3 quick answers to the 3 questions that are there right now. Don't post another one. I will not answer a new one. I will very briefly touch on these 3. And because it will be available as a recording, I'm not doing people a very big injustice, the ones who have to leave now. Alexander Villas-Boas, more a comment than a question, but please give a brief comment if I understand correctly that this understanding of reality opens up a huge field for exploring new communication pathways of, yes, information about experience between life forms, pathways. Yes, it's conceivable that the dissociative boundary is porous at some level, and that there can be commerce, there can be exchange of experiential influences across the porosity of the dissociative boundary. That is conceivable. Jennifer, so is dissociation an illusion, or is what you are saying, or is it what you are saying is closest to reality? Is dissociation in itself a form of perception, so could also be subjective or false? What happens when there is disagreement on the boundaries or perception of dissociation? Can we even have validated agreement or disagreement on that? Perception and dissociation are 2 different things. I think perception arises from dissociation. The screen of perception is what appears on the dissociative boundary of a dissociative process. Without dissociation, there would be no perception. There would be no perception of a world out there. There would only be endogenous experiences akin to emotions and thoughts that arise within ourselves without being dependent from an external, on an external world. Is dissociation is it an illusion? Well, this is it's a matter of how you use the words. There is a phenomenon that we call dissociation. That phenomenon exists. As such, it is not an illusion. Something happens that we call dissociation. What is an illusion is that there are actual multiple separate subjects. This is an illusion that arises as a consequence of the real process of dissociation. I hope I made sense of this clearly. Ines Azaias, so do we have control of our life, free will, or does life happen to us, disease, suffering, happiness? I think it depends on what you call I, your I. Ultimately, your real life is, your real I is universal consciousness. That's the I that looks out from your eyes. There is only one. It's the same in you. It's the same in me. It's universal consciousness. That universal subject has free will by definition, because to not have free will, something has to be imposed on your will from the outside. But there is nothing outside universal consciousness. By definition, it's all there is. So it has free will, and it also has free necessity. At the level of universal consciousness, there is no distinction between will and necessity. What it wills is what it needs to do. What it needs to do is what it wills, because there is nothing outside it. I hope you follow me. It wills what it wills because it is what it is. As such, it wills by necessity, the necessity of being what it is. But what it needs to do is what it wills. So there is free will. So I wrote extensively about it in 2 chapters of my book, Brief Peeks Beyond. It's very difficult to put in a nutshell what is a subtle compatibilist argument. I think at a universal level, free will and determinism are the same thing. It's not that one is right and the other is wrong. It's that both are right. There is no distinction between them. The necessity is the will, and the will is the necessity. You will what you need, and you need what you will. That is for the case of your real subject, your real I, the real I that looks out from your eyes. But your individual self, which is a narrative you tell yourself, it is an illusion that arises from dissociation. And now the question is, does this illusory I have free will? Probably not, very little, if any. You can probably choose your mortgage package. You can probably choose the roads you take when you go on a holiday. But can you choose your next thought? Can you choose how you feel? You can't. I mean, I can't. I cannot choose my next thought. Most of the times I can't. I'm neurotic. I can't choose to not be neurotic. I can't choose how I feel. My thoughts often overwhelm me. They hound me. They circle me like ravenous dogs. I cannot choose my preferences. I like what I like because I like what I like, because I am what I am. Otherwise, I would have different preferences. My life would be much easier. So do I have free will? Very little. But this very little free will is itself an illusion that arises from the illusion of a separate individual self. So in that sense, that lack of free will is also an illusion. It's utterly unimportant. It is only important insofar as you're caught up in the illusion. Within the illusion, it has a reality, an illusory reality. And it's real in the sense that as an illusion, it sets the tone for how you feel. So it can turn your life into a nightmare or a dream, depending on how you go about it. It's an illusion that sets the tone of your experiences. It isn't real, but its effects are real.
So if you enjoy these discussions and you want to join us, discuss these with Bernardo Kastrup and quite an amazing community of meditators, mystics, philosophers, scientists, and simply ordinary people who are very curious about reality, you can find us in the links below or at adventuresinawareness.com. You can also hugely support this channel by hitting like, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts, questions, and reflections in the comments section below.